Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Moises Garduño Garcia, and I am professor at the Center for International Relations of the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences here at National Autonomous University of Mexico. And today I have the privilege to chair this keynote conference by Professor Sara Roy from Harvard University. This conference is the opening of the academic activities of our research project in the 2022-2023 cycle, the Middle East after COVID-19 crisis. So welcome all of you, and thank you for attending this event. I know that 5 minutes is not enough to introduce the professional profile and academic background of Professor Roy. However, let me proudly say that today we have the chance to talk with one of the most prominent scholars in the field of economy of Palestine and the economy of Gaza. And I say this not only for her academic contributions, but also for her particular style to make academia with sensitivity, criticism, and humanism. Let me share with you that 3 days ago, I was talking with a very dear friend who is around here, Indira Sanchez, who's a professor in the Tec de Monterrey here in Mexico. And we were talking about the Spanish government's surrender in the case of Western Sahara. Indira was deeply concerned about the future of Sahrawis and about the future of many other social causes around the global South. Of course, my reaction was immediately to think about the route to Palestine in the strategy of, for example, the Abraham agreements, the normalization process with countries like Sudan, Bahrain, and Morocco itself. And I was thinking in this strategy of depoliticize the Palestinian issue, turning the Palestinian issue just an humanitarian assistance issue, a complex conflict in the public, transnational public sphere. And it's because these kind of preoccupations, these kind of concerns, that we invited Professor Roy to talk this afternoon with us, especially from the experience in Gaza, where it's extremely difficult to document facts, but at the same time, I consider it's extremely important to know about it. Professor Roy is a senior research scholar at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, specializing in the Palestinian economy, Palestinian Islamism, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Dr. Sara Roy began her research in the Gaza Strip and West Bank in 1985 with a focus on the economic, social, and political development of the Gaza Strip and on US foreign policy to the area. Since then, she has written extensively on the Palestinian economy, particularly in Gaza, and on Gaza's de-development, a concept she originated. Dr. Roy is the author of several books like the Gaza Strip, The Political Economy of De-Development, the Gaza Strip Survey, Failing Peace, Gaza and the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, and she is the editor of the Economics of Middle East Peace, a reassessment. Her book, Hamas and Civil Society in Gaza, Engaging the Islamic Social Sector, was a winner of the 2012 British Kuwait Friendship Society Book Prize in the Middle Eastern Studies and was named one of the Choice Outstanding Academic Titles, Top 25 Academic Books for 2012. Her new book in 2021 is entitled On Silence in Gaza, Reflections on Resistance. Dr. Roy has also authored over 100 publications dealing with Palestinian issues and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and has lectured widely in the United States, Europe, the Middle East, Australia, and hopefully very soon Latin America, and I say this for Mexico, of course. Professor Roy, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity that you are giving us this afternoon. The floor is yours, Professor. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Garcia, for your lovely and generous introduction. I also want to thank you for your understanding and willingness to postpone this lecture, which was very helpful to me at a difficult time. So thank you. I would like to begin with a story, which I've told before, but I think it bears repeating here. It was the summer of 1985, as you said, when I first went to Gaza. It was my first visit there. And I was taken on a tour of the area by a woman who would become a dear friend of mine. Her name was Alia. She drove me along Gaza's coastal road, where I saw an elderly Palestinian man standing on the shoreline with some boxes of oranges next to him. I was puzzled by this, and I asked Alia to stop the car. One by one, the elderly Palestinian took an orange and threw it into the sea. His was not an action of playfulness, but of pain and regret. His movements were slow and labored, as if the weight of each orange was more than he could bear. Not understanding what I was seeing, I asked Alia why he was doing this. She explained that he had been prevented from exporting his oranges to Israel, as he had done many times before, and rather than watch them rot in his orchards, the old man chose to cast them into the sea. I've never forgotten this scene and the impact that it had on me. Nearly 40 years later, after peace agreements, economic protocols, roadmaps, so-called disengagements, donor conferences, reconciliation attempts, airports, seaports, and proposals for offshore artificial islands in Gaza, Gazans are still casting their oranges into the sea. Yet Gaza is no longer where I found it so long ago, but someplace far worse. Gaza's trajectory over the last 54 years, and most notably over the last generation, has taken it from a politically and economically integrated territory to an isolated enclave, from a functional economy to a dysfunctional one, from a productive society to an impoverished one, and from a people with nationalist claims to a humanitarian problem where most men, women, and children require some form of humanitarian assistance to sustain themselves. These damaging transformations, among others, have become formalized and permanent, shaping a future that is both partial and disfigured. What is happening to Gaza and the West Bank is catastrophic. It is also deliberate, conscious, and planned. In my early research, I was primarily concerned with the occupation and its economic impact on the Gaza Strip, because it was the economy that so starkly and unsparingly illustrated the profound inequities that form the structural and philosophical core of occupation policy. My initial focus on the economy stemmed from the profound shock and confusion I felt when I first lived in Gaza nearly 37 years ago. The chasm between what I had been taught and what I encountered in Israel's treatment of the Palestinians shocked me. As an American Jew growing up in the 1960s and 1970s and educated in elite schools, I was told, often implicitly, to believe and never question Israeli beneficence, morality, and superiority, and Arab ineptitude and incivility. Although my parents taught me to think critically and often provided much needed counterpoints, the intellectual and political weight of the times was difficult to cast aside. There was little, if any, context for speaking critically about Israel or sympathetically or ethically about Arabs, who were forbidden, as we were, to embrace the word Palestine or Palestinian. Although I had visited Israel many times during my childhood, my first trip to the West Bank and Gaza occurred, as I said, in the summer of 1985. I traveled there against the protestations of the Israeli part of my family to conduct fieldwork for my doctoral dissertation, which examined an American program of bilateral economic assistance to the Palestinian people. My thesis asked whether economic development was possible under conditions of military occupation, and my search for an answer immersed me in a reality, indeed a world, I was wholly unaware of and unprepared for. As a well-trained graduate student, I felt I understood the political complexities of the area, the actors involved, their histories, and the many arguments and sides of the conflict. I went, I believed, with a critical but open mind. I went, I believed, prepared for anything. I was not prepared for what I encountered. Those first months in Gaza and the West Bank changed my life. I distinctly remember the day I first entered Gaza. I had been in the West Bank for some time and had acquired some familiarity with the people and the region and felt comfortable living there despite the harshness of the occupation. However, the thought of living in the Gaza Strip made me nervous, even scared. I had heard terrible and frightening stories about Gaza and its people, especially from my Israeli friends and family. I was taken to the Marna House, which was then one of only 2 hotels in the Gaza Strip. And I was told the best, and I read the safest, place for foreigners to stay. The hotel was managed by Alia Shawa, who belonged to one of Gaza's oldest and wealthiest families, and who, as I said earlier, would become my very dear friend. Alia welcomed me, but clearly viewed me with some suspicion. After all, why would an American be visiting Gaza? And when she learned I was Jewish, her concern and my anxiety grew. In those days, prior to the first Palestinian uprising, or Intifada, which began in December of 1987, one of the first questions I was almost always asked by Gazans was, "Are you a Christian?" I never lied and told everyone who asked me that I was Jewish. To my surprise, it was not fear or anger I typically encountered when people learned I was Jewish, but some shock, suspicion, some confusion, and a great deal of curiosity. I took advantage of their curiosity and my somewhat unique status to begin a discussion of why I was there, explaining that I had come to Gaza to learn about its economy, people, society, and history, and about military occupation and how it affects their lives. I thought it would take me a long time to gain their trust, but again, I was wrong. Within 1 week of arriving in Gaza, I was immersed in local life in a manner I could not possibly have foreseen, taken from one end of the strip to the other by people I barely knew, but whom Alia initially vetted. I encountered areas seldom, if ever, seen by foreigners, helped by people whose support and encouragement would have been unimaginable to me just days before. And many of those same people would later help me collect data during the first Palestinian uprising for my book on de-development, and in some cases risk their lives doing so. I was invited into homes, both rich and poor, where no request was too great or question too burdensome. Not only did my being Jewish cease to be a source of concern, it became an asset. People could not do enough to help me. Although I could not possibly have known it at the time, that summer of 1985 set the stage for the next decades of my life. The injustice of the occupation and the inability of Palestinians to defend against it affected me deeply. My research among them was not only a matter of scholarship. For me, it went to the core of who I was, where I came from, the meaning of my Judaism, my identity as a child of Holocaust survivors, my relationship with Israel, and the nature and purpose of my work. One of the most troubling and frightening aspects of the occupation during my early encounter with it was its very mundane nature. For Palestinians, occupation was the ordinary, a way of life that had to be lived defensively, without recourse or appeal, without protection or choice, largely absent of accountability, predictability, rationality, or control. Furthermore, the distortion of Palestinian life remained unquestioned by those beyond it for whom the realities of occupation were wholly unknown. What was for Palestinians a narrative of crisis, of territorial dispossession and displacement, was for others an example of legitimate and benign control. It is this absence of context and its continued mystification that my research has always sought to redress. From the earliest time in Gaza, the underlying impulse of my work has always been towards society, women, children, families, neighborhoods, and communities. I focus not only on the occupation's destructive impact on people, but on how they, whether as individuals or communities, were able to resist it and maintain a meaningful way of life. The strength of Gaza's people amazed me, and it still does, a topic that has received far too little attention in the literature on the conflict. My most powerful experiences in Gaza and the most poignant memories I have are not of violence or despair, but of kindness and generosity, creativity and determination, the qualities that drew me to the people of Gaza from the very beginning. Society in Gaza has long struggled to remain whole and humane, despite the immense and largely unabated pressures imposed upon it. Pressures that in the last 15 years in particular have assumed new dimensions of cruelty, which have impoverished and imprisoned Gaza's people, denying them the right to live and work as we do, to plan, to contemplate an ordinary and productive life, to live with possibility and dignity. In other lectures and writings, I have examined in detail some key paradigm shifts in the way the conflict and Palestinians are perceived and treated, which took place over the last generation or more since the start of the Oslo process. I will briefly highlight four of the most important of these shifts because they have had a damaging and defining impact on Gaza and provide a critical framework within which to understand some of the themes I shall subsequently discuss. Now, the first paradigm shift concerns the belief that occupation is reversible and should be reversed, which was largely unquestioned and uncontested, and was a catalyzing force behind many social, political, and economic initiatives. This belief that the occupation and the forces that sustain it can and should be stopped was long ago reversed and is powerfully illustrated in the formalization and acceptance by Israel and key members of the international donor community of Palestinian fragmentation and isolation. Within this framework established by Oslo, and when I say Oslo, of course, I'm referring to the Oslo peace agreements and peace process, enforced integration, or should I say incorporation, which defined Israeli policy in the first 2 decades of occupation, was replaced by a policy of separation, whereby Gaza and the West Bank were separated demographically and geographically. States the political analyst Maureen Rabbani, the Oslo agreements were designed to separate Israel from the occupied territories, but not as part of a process of decolonization, but as a process that separated Israel from Arab population centers and separated those centers, those Arab centers, from each other. And this is why there are no references in the Oslo agreements to occupation, self-determination, or statehood. Instead, a Palestinian authority with very limited jurisdictional control was established within a fragmented territorial structure to ensure security for Israel, while Israel continued to expand its settlements and incrementally and with determination dispossess Palestinians of their land, water, and other resources, what Rabbani has termed separation with Palestinian consent. Furthermore, the basis for the resolution of the conflict under Oslo shifted from international law, where Palestinians had more parity with Israel, to bilateral relations between Israel and the Palestinians, where the disparity in power, the gross asymmetries in power between Israel and the Palestinians, meant that Israeli interests and priorities were not only primary, but enforceable. This is why permanent status negotiations over refugees, Jerusalem, borders, and settlements never materialized. Under Oslo, Israel did not end its control over Palestinians, but strengthened it and deepened it. As Rabbani observes, where the Palestinians prior to Oslo unambiguously constituted a people in the political sense, unified and represented by cohesive national institutions, broadly considered legitimate, and in which differences were largely determined by political affiliation and ideology rather than geographical location, today it would be more accurate to speak of disaggregated Palestinian communities that have but scant unity of purpose, are themselves increasingly fragmented, and lack any form of coherent institutional representation. Today, over 28 years after the first Oslo Agreement was signed, Israel maintains direct control over all of East Jerusalem, 60% of the West Bank, having removed most of the inhabitants of the very crucial Jordan Valley, and primary security control over an additional 21% of the West Bank that is allegedly under the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority, or PA. Israel has also isolated and imprisoned Gaza, historically the center of resistance to occupation, and without which a Palestinian state cannot be meaningfully established. Gaza's isolation came to be seen as exceptional or marginal, existing outside a Palestinian state and a Palestinian nation. This in turn supports Israel's primary strategic interest to thwart any political settlement that treats the Gaza Strip and West Bank as one entity, thereby preserving Palestinian division, making it impossible for the PA to return to Gaza, and precluding the establishment of a Palestinian state on land that Israel claims as its own. In fact, Israel's Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, has stated explicitly that he opposes the establishment of a Palestinian state. Yet the policies that have come to define Gaza as exceptional are simply extensions, albeit more extreme, of policies long used to separate and isolate Palestinians in the West Bank and in Israel. In this regard, Gaza's status is part of a long and consistent policy continuum of containment, removal, and now erasure. As such, Gaza became the model for the fragmentation of the West Bank into small, disconnected enclaves under constant assault, where territorial annexation, demographic isolation, land dispossession, and population pacification have been taken to their natural endpoint, according to the analyst Tarek Bakoni. In this regard, Bakoni argues, Gaza ceases to be exceptional by viewing fragmentation and annexation in the West Bank through the lens of Gaza. Still, it is important to understand that these policies of separation and exclusion make it difficult, if not impossible, for Palestinians to imagine a larger sense of a collective. And without that sense, exclusion becomes the defining basis for politics and policy. In fact, given the years of separation and division of Gaza and the West Bank, and the consistent failure to achieve reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas, whose division has worsened conditions in both territories, one local analyst writes, there is a growing feeling among some segments of Palestinian society that the Gaza Strip must seriously consider finding exits from the humanitarian crisis that include an independent Gaza entity. Hamas also sees the division as a way of stabilizing and maintaining its control over Gaza, and as some analysts have argued, as a springboard for extending its control into the West Bank. Israel has long pursued this division between Gaza and the West Bank, which is one reason Israel continues to impose the blockade on Gaza and why Israel allows humanitarian relief and monies into Gaza. Critically, the occupation, which now includes the damaging 15-year blockade or siege on Gaza, has long remained unchallenged by an international, largely Western order. Hence, in the absence of meaningful legal and political pressure from the West, the presence of the Israeli army on Palestinian territory and military assaults against Palestinians, especially in Gaza, remain unopposed. Indeed, after the May 2021 hostilities, the new Israeli government announced that it will continue the blockade of Gaza and stop the reconstruction process. However, in order to prevent more immediate economic collapse and avert another conflagration with Hamas, the Israeli government announced some measures to ease conditions in Gaza, including an increase in the number of work permits for Palestinians working in Israel, which includes thousands of Gaza laborers, allowing the entry of money from Qatar for grants of humanitarian aid totaling about $100 per recipient, and allowing the entry of more building and other materials, although thousands of spare parts and other items considered by Israel to have possible military application remain blocked. And they also spoke about widening the fishing zone. However, the blockade, the most destructive measure, remains in place. It should be pointed out that these concessions, and that's what they are, which find similar expression in the West Bank, have nothing to do with rehabilitating Gaza's economy, but are meant, as they long have, as economic sedatives designed only to keep people afloat and for many to prevent hunger and starvation. In effect, demanding that Palestinians give up their rights for food and electricity. Or as one Palestinian analyst put it when referring to a promised aid package for the West Bank, the aid, he said, would be the difference between life that is miserable but manageable as opposed to one that would result in complete meltdown or collapse. It should come as no surprise, therefore, that the World Bank found that Gaza's economy has experienced a multi-decade process of deindustrialization, producing an unemployment rate of 45% and a poverty rate of 50%, which I might say are underestimates according to other sources, and where 80% of the population depends on some form of international assistance. Overall, the UN, specifically the UN Conference on Trade and Development, further estimates that due to a range of Israeli measures, including the blockade on Gaza, settlement expansion, restrictions on trade and movement, the collective impact of all this on the Palestinian economy as a whole since 2000, over the last 20 plus years, has resulted in a loss of $57.7 billion. Little, of course, can be achieved or made sustainable in the absence of a political solution. Without such a solution, the occupied protects the security of the occupier for economic and humanitarian gain, while human rights abuses continue. This points to a second paradigm shift. Prior to Oslo, there was a belief among Israelis and within the international community generally that peace and occupation were incompatible. The former could not be achieved in the presence of the latter. This too has changed and did so long ago. Peace and occupation have long been considered compatible, arguably complementary, as seen most recently in the Abraham Accords, the so-called peace agreements between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, which are designed, in my view, at least to eliminate the Palestinian issue altogether. They are also seen in an expanding settlement enterprise, which is now considered vital to the protection and security of Israelis. Hence, Palestine's effective dismemberment and the permanence of territorial fragmentation are accepted by key members of the international community, particularly in the West, as legitimate and benign and totally manageable. This reality, to which the international community has largely acceded, is further characterized by a willingness to legitimize Israel's occupation as long as there is no accepted agreement to end it. In this way, the occupation was transformed from a political and legal issue with international legitimacy, where the inalienable right of national self-determination for Palestinians was foundational, into a simple dispute over borders, where rules of war apply rather than those of occupation. This is the third paradigm shift. In this way, Palestinian rights were more visibly removed from the political and legal framework for resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This recasting from occupation to war is acutely clear and defining in Israel's relationship with Gaza, and was made easier after Hamas's 2006 election victory and 2007 takeover of the Gaza Strip, a recasting the international community has largely come to accept, if not embrace. Henceforth, Gaza was identified solely with Hamas and therefore as hostile and alien. Now, the growing inapplicability of occupation as an analytical and legal framework introduced a fourth paradigm shift regarding Israeli policy towards the Palestinians and their territories. In the West Bank, this shift in Israeli policy is away from occupation and towards annexation and imposed sovereignty over Palestinian lands. In Gaza, this shift in Israeli policy moved from one that sought to control and dominate the Palestinian economy, shaping it to Israel's own interests, as occurred in the first 2 decades of occupation in particular, to one that, undermines and ruins the economy through the imposition of a blockade, which is really an intensified military closure. I should also add that some form of closure has been in effect in Gaza for over 30 years, starting in 1991, and has never been lifted. Its most extreme expression, of course, is the blockade, now, as I said, in its 15th year. What is subject to change is the intensity of the closure. Perhaps most striking of all, the ruination of Gaza's economy has transformed Palestinians from people with national, political, and economic rights into a weakened community dependent on humanitarian assistance for whom the international community is wholly responsible. It is no longer, and in fact has not been for a long time, a question of economic growth, change or reform, freedom or sovereignty, but of essential humanitarian needs, of reducing the needs and rights of over 2 million people in the Gaza Strip to an exercise in counting calories and truckloads of food. It is correct to say, therefore, that humanitarianism has become an instrument of military control. The deliberate reduction of Palestinians to a humanitarian issue, deprived of political and economic rights, and dependent on the international community for sustenance, positions relief, not progress, as the primary, if not the only political option for Gaza. Hence, the purpose of economic activity for Palestinians has had little if anything to do, with achieving sustainable economic growth or economic structural transformation, impossible in any event under occupation, and everything to do with maintaining a presence on the land and finding a means to survive. As such, humanitarianism has come to define the way the international community interacts with Palestinians, who are made irrelevant and disposable as political and national actors, in effect invalidated. In this way, Israel and the West maintain a humanitarian problem to manage a political one, in this case, subduing an undesirable and inconvenient population. A senior official, at the Israeli human rights organization, Gisha, that monitors conditions in Gaza, distilled Israel's approach. He said, in the rest of the world, we try to bring people up to the humanitarian standard. Gaza is the only place where we're trying to push them down to keep them at the lowest possible indicators, end quote. In this way, humanitarian aid is used not only to meet the rapidly expanding needs of an increasingly impoverished population, but is also used to prolong conflict and suffering. If a policy exists, it is one of not finding solutions, as one colleague of mine put it. The resulting context has proved increasingly resistant to testimony and evidence, despite the fact that this is one of the best documented conflicts in the world, according to Michael Link, who is the UN Special Rapporteur for the Palestinian territories. Consequently, over the last generation especially, the occupation has deepened and assumed a particularly destructive quality. Arguably, the Israeli authorities have slowly shifted their framework of humanitarianism to one of counterterrorism, which is used to justify attacks on Gaza and its disablement. In Gaza, the occupation is meant to prevent any kind of normal environment from emerging, institutionalizing in both practical and psychological terms a form of abnormality that resists change the longer it is allowed to last and take shape. This abnormality is rooted fundamentally in cutting most of Gaza's ties to the outside world. Young people, the majority of Gaza's population, have no conception of the world beyond Gaza. To them, the world is Gaza. They do not know what it means to board a plane, to board a ship, or even a train. The incarceration of Gaza assumed a deepened dimension with the completion this past December of yet another wall and maritime barrier around Gaza, replete with guard towers, barbed wire, sensors, radar, spotlights, surveillance cameras, sirens, and a new feature, an underground wall built against the Hamas tunnels. This wall, which is really a steel fence, costs $1.1 billion and is reported to be 65 kilometers or 40 miles long, covering the length of Gaza's border with Israel, beginning at the Egyptian border, going around Gaza and jutting out into the Mediterranean Sea. It is over 6 meters or 20 feet high. The length of the underground reinforced concrete wall, studded with sensors, has not been disclosed by the Israeli authorities, but it is believed to be several meters below ground. The underground maritime barrier is said to include electronic devices to detect infiltration by the sea and a remote-controlled weapon system. It should be noted that in 2020, Egypt also built a fence measuring 8.7 miles along its border with Gaza. According to Defense Minister Benny Gantz, this structure places an iron wall, sensors, and concrete between the terror organization, and here, of course, he's referring to Hamas, and the residents of Israel's south. Yet, according to the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, since December of 2004, when the first Hamas tunnel was activated, to this very day, 17 years later, there have been only 6 infiltrations into Israel by means of tunnels. The last time was July 28, 2014. Since then, nothing. Kitchen knives, they wrote, have claimed more victims. Israel's new wall was built with 140,000 tons of steel and iron and 220,000 trucks of concrete. Imagine if these materials were put into rebuilding Gaza and its economy, which has been encircled by other barriers for the last 26 years. As Ahmed Abu Artema, a peace activist in Gaza, stated, the mistake that Israel insists on repeating is that it deals with the Palestinian issue as a security issue and ignores the root of the problem. The withdrawal of law and with it justice in Gaza, combined with economic collapse, has not only necessitated humanitarian intervention, but has also situated Gaza between periodic conflict and potential catastrophe, as a colleague of mine put it. In a context where catastrophe has in effect become a form of governance, resistance becomes disarrayed, leading to a crisis of how to resist. In this way, Israel rules by maintaining a liminal, indeterminate state where the sites of resistance are narrow and ineffective. As my colleague put it, Israel governs by how near to the disaster threshold Gaza is allowed to go. Within this mode of rule, Palestinians are regarded as terrorists or charity cases, where relief assistance is now treated as a salary. Israel's objective in Gaza, therefore, is limited and contained. To avert any large-scale disaster, such as starvation, which is a new and terrible metric, Gaza is controlled by the threat of wholesale calamity, be it hunger, institutional destruction, or continued economic demise, where suffering has become a legitimate instrument of control. Having articulated a framework based on these paradigm shifts, I'd like to now turn to some prominent themes in my research on Gaza. The first theme concerns the nature of violence. Now, by this, I mean, what constitutes violence in the Palestinian context? The pressures on the population are immense and unrelenting and include, as I said earlier, high levels of unemployment and impoverishment, considerable infrastructural damage and destruction, and environmental degradation, where it is no exaggeration to say that Gaza's water and soil are dangerously contaminated, what one scientist referred to as a toxic ecology or biosphere of war. Those are his words. Hence, violence in Gaza is not only or even primarily defined in militaristic terms, but in everyday ordinary acts: the absence of clean water, insufficient supplies of electricity, the struggle to find a job, the struggle to feed one's children, accessing school safely, reaching a hospital, even burying a loved one. In this regard, Palestinian economic activity should be understood less as a state-building exercise and far more as a struggle to survive, as a struggle for rights, and as a form of nonviolent resistance. And can humanitarianism itself be considered a form of violence? That is, keeping people alive through subventions while they are being impoverished and attacked. By operating in an environment where the emergency is not temporary, but permanent, and through the aid provided by the humanitarian community, which is clearly needed, the occupier is able to enforce and sustain oppression. In this regard, when donors speak of restoring Gaza to a state of pre-conflict, they reveal a fundamental, if not cynical, misunderstanding of life in Gaza, and always have. Gaza has never truly enjoyed a state without conflict or violence, broadly defined. Gaza exists in a state of perpetual conflict, where quiet is not the absence of conflict, nor is it peace. Defining it as such, as the international community has long done, introduces yet another distortion into Gaza's lived reality. Or as another scholar, colleague of mine, termed it, if security concerns start and end with Hamas rockets, then they are not about peace or justice, but complete quiet from Palestinians, whom Israel expects to be submissive and docile in the face of human rights violations. Similarly, nothing in Gaza is post-trauma. And such a definition ignores the nature of trauma among Palestinians, especially in Gaza. Minimally, at a minimum, 10% of the population, over 200,000 people, need serious mental health intervention, according to the Gaza Community Mental Health Program, and I suspect this is an underestimate. The intergenerational impact of trauma on both an individual and societal level is not to be underestimated. It is an enormously serious problem. The second thing, the failure by Israel and the West to connect Palestinian actions, both violent and nonviolent, with underlying conditions of impoverishment and desperation. This failure, born of political interest and racism, has been consistent throughout my experience, even during major assaults in Gaza. As far as Gaza is concerned, the blockade is now an accepted, if not largely unquestioned, and institutionalized part of the occupation in the Strip, as I think I mentioned earlier. The 15-year blockade is a clear violation of international humanitarian law and has proved to be one of the most destructive measures imposed on society and economy. And I'd be happy to discuss some of the details of the blockade or its impact later. By 2016, for example, less than 10% of the homes destroyed in the 2014 summer assault known as Operation Protective Edge had been rebuilt because of the restrictions on the entry of building materials. Referring to the damage inflicted during the May 2021 hostilities, almost a year ago now, the Middle East director of the International Committee of the Red Cross stated, quote, "The damage inflicted in less than 2 weeks will take years, if not decades, to rebuild," end quote. The blockade is not about toppling the Hamas regime as stated by the Israeli government. It is about exactly the opposite, maintaining the division and separation of the two territories by containing Hamas within Gaza under Israeli control and immiserating Gaza's people, society, and economy so that Gaza remains removed from any future political equation or resolution, thereby ensuring that no viable Palestinian state or political construct can emerge. If there is any doubt of this, one need only posit the following question: would Israeli policy change in Gaza if Hamas disappeared tomorrow? Social problems to which Hamas directly contributes, which arise from poverty and discrimination, are described in terms of culture, religion, or nationalism, and are often treated as terrorism. The larger objective is to marginalize Palestinians and their rights and claims, which Palestinians will not relinquish. As one Palestinian scholar, Professor Nadra Shalhoub-Kevorkian, put it, Palestinians have come to be viewed as present absentees in Israeli, and I might add, official American and European eyes, whose very existence is a provocation to the state. The third theme is dehumanization. If there is one theme over my decades of research that is the strongest and most consistent and unrelenting, it is the dehumanization of Palestinians, primarily by Israelis, but also by American and European officials and other Arabs. This dynamic has not changed in my long experience, and it finds a range of expressions from the more benign, relatively speaking, a kind of disdainful tolerance, to the more pernicious, condoned erasure, where entire families in Gaza, according to the Israeli journalist Amira Haas, are being targeted and killed. The question still is, why has the international community remained silent or failed to respond with any humane policy? A friend in Gaza wanted me to share the following with you. It speaks to a more subtle form of dehumanization that is also very harmful and damaging. My friend is a young professional woman who works for an American NGO. Talking about the 11-day assault on Gaza last May, she said, "We all had lived through terrible days. It was so terrifying. When it ended, my boss told me and the other Palestinian employees to return to work immediately, just a day after the aggression ended. When we asked for some more time to grieve and recover and to process what we had just been through, he responded by saying, 'At least you have a job.' I felt like we were all commodities, as if we are cheap, where suffering and resilience are expected. We are not allowed any space to navigate exhaustion. It was really painful." My friends also argue another point, that the question of who counts, that in their view, Palestinians do not count as human beings, is not the only question that must be asked. The other question is, how do we count? How do they count? For many of my friends, Palestinians matter only as subjects on which new military technologies are tested and sold. This is a common belief in Gaza, as is a sense of abandonment, that no one, including their own leadership, both Fatah and Hamas, is accountable for or cares about Palestinian suffering. Palestinians in Gaza truly believe they are on their own. As I wrote in my statement before the United Nations Security Council following the 2014 summer assault, people in Gaza now finally believe Israelis when they say there are no civilians in Gaza. Yet Palestinians are still shocked at the dehumanizing manner with which they are treated. Their sense of disbelief and incredulity remain. Theme 4, where the present, though diminished, is still better than the future. Perhaps one of the saddest changes I have witnessed over the last 3 and more decades is a belief that the future will only bring greater suffering than the present. This is due not only to Israeli repression, but also to repression by the Hamas and Fatah authorities and the unprecedented schisms in the Palestinian political sphere. The contrast with the first Intifada is striking. Then people truly believed that a better future was not only possible, but attainable and organized around that belief. Today, as one friend in his 20s recently told me, it is a crime to think about things improving. It is a crime even to think about things staying the same. So diminished, people live their lives with whatever they have, according to deprivation and scarcity. Having enough food, clothing, or electricity have been elevated to an aspiration. Many of my friends organize their day according to when they have electricity. There is no interest or energy to think about much else, let alone larger political or national issues. Another colleague, a highly educated woman and mother of 2 young children, told me that no one thinks about Jerusalem or the right of return anymore, but about finding a job and feeding their families. The need is not for a homeland, and the fear is not its absence. The need is for a livelihood, no matter how meager, clean water, and sanctuary, and the fear is that they are unattainable. In a recent conversation with another friend and colleague, he described the attenuation of life in this way. We do not even think about jobs anymore. All we think about is electricity and when we will get it. The constriction of life and the individual and collective accommodation to it has been accompanied by a detachment from politics and an absence of demands beyond those that are immediate, narrow, and basic to survival. In this regard, my young female friend, whom I quoted earlier, also told me, my friends and I ask ourselves, do we know what we are passionate about? What is passion when you are in survival mode? There are no solutions, so we just talk. Do you know what it means when you cannot imagine life outside Gaza or inside it? We live with what we are given. And she added, there is no space to think critically. Critical thinkers are alienated from family and friends. Palestinians emphasize their existence, but it no longer seems connected to a larger context of national liberation, as it once was. Hence, the increasing difficulty of people to connect as indigenous to their own land. Theme 5, the permeation of loss and the waning of deterrence. Simply put, Palestinians in Gaza have reached a point, in fact, I believe they reached it a long time ago, where they feel they have little, if anything, left to lose. This sense is not so much measured materially as it is psychologically, where more destruction does not inflict appreciably more pain. This sense of loss was particularly pronounced following the summer 2014 assault. My last trip to Gaza was in the fall of 2016, and my observations from that trip were published in an article in the London Review of Books where I asked, what more can Israel inflict when the loss of entire families is a daily topic of conversation? And as one Israeli analyst put it, this sense of having nothing left to lose is also true of Hamas, where continued material losses have reached a point of saturation, with little, if any, added pain. In this context, Israel's deterrence policy, he argues, carries little, if any, weight, which strengthens Hamas's strategic position. I would also add here that although many, perhaps most Palestinians in Gaza criticize, if not condemn, Hamas's governance and ideology, there has been continuous support for its central role in the resistance when conflict occurs. But I should emphasize that no one in Gaza wants war, no one. What is most concerning, in my view, is that even with the infusion of aid or increased levels of economic assistance to Gaza, what some donors erroneously call development assistance, little will change in the continued presence of the blockade and the occupation. Theme 6. Residing outside of politics, Gaza as a template. For now, Gaza has been largely removed from the sphere of politics. And as I stated before, relief is the primary, if not the only choice left, at least in the short to medium term. Is Gaza a template for a new politics of exclusion that can be found in other contexts? And here I borrow from a recent essay I co-authored with a colleague in France. We write, Gaza, of course, is an extreme case, but there are similar situations developing around the world, other places of inattention. In the US, for example, making America great again still goes hand in hand with sending people back to where they came from, where they will remain unseen. Similarly, millions are kept in refugee camps in Turkey, Libya, or Europe itself, with very little prospect of leaving or earning a living. Families are kept for years in camps, caught between the hope of an improbable asylum in Europe and the fear of being sent back. They are increasingly seen as a nuisance to be contained and isolated rather than welcomed and integrated. They are the European versions of Gaza without the bombs. Many Gazas are developing around the world, from Gaza to Lesbos, from Lesbos to Afghanistan and beyond. Sites of exception are growing where people are barred from legitimate political discourse, unrecognized but kept alive, without claim to community or nationhood, where the principal aim of politics is to control unwanted populations with no vision of anything but further control, where the problem is that they exist at all. And my last thing, Palestine as an idea and the widening of discourse. It is often difficult to end a presentation on Gaza and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on a positive note, but there are positives, and I shall conclude with this one. In a webinar I attended a few months ago, one speaker asked the question, what is Palestine? A place, a country, a site of desire, a site of return, an idea. He argued that the Palestinian struggle has been globalized via the internet and incorporated into other struggles like Black Lives Matter. One sees, for example, Palestinians on Twitter expressing solidarity with demonstrators in Ferguson, Missouri, who were protesting a grand jury decision not to indict a white police officer who killed unarmed Black teenager Michael Brown in an August 9th, 2014 shooting. The global feeling for Palestine, for what Palestine stands for, he continued, speaks to the idea of Palestine as a struggle against injustice and for justice, as defiance and steadfastness. In this way, the idea of Palestine, like that of Black Lives Matter, means something, as it speaks to power, not only or even in binary terms, but in larger conceptual terms, such as justice and fairness. In this way, the struggle for Palestine is globalized beyond left-wing solidarity and is expressed not as the politics of identity, but as the politics of identification, moving beyond just an association with a specific piece of territory to something far larger, and speaking to the sense of power that Palestinians have, which is so often overlooked. In my long engagement with Israel-Palestine, I have seen a great deal of change, much of it negative, but also positive. I very much agree that Palestine has come to stand for an idea and not just a place, and I believe this will continue to grow. Israel too stands for an idea, and the struggle between the two ideas has at its core the struggle around the question of justice. What also has changed for the better, and dramatically so, is the expanding space for a counter-narrative, for asking different kinds of questions and for understanding Palestinians and Israelis outside the binary straitjackets in which they have often been placed by each other and by those beyond. The changes within the progressive Jewish community in the United States, for example, over the last 2 decades, have been striking. In the long run, this can only benefit both peoples. And as I've also seen, there are fewer forms of counterattack, although the attacks do continue. In my ongoing discussions with friends and colleagues in Palestine, several things are clear. Palestinians refuse to believe that they belong where Israel and the West have placed them, that what they are facing is a result of what they have done, to borrow from the writer James Baldwin. The notion of refusal is growing among Palestinians, refusing to accept the status quo as normal, the refusal to accept others' definition of who Palestinians are, or as Professor Shalhut Kevorkian said, the unending refusal of Palestinians to accept our uprooting as the only mode of maintaining a secular state. My young colleague, whom I mentioned or whom I quoted earlier, told me about runaway packets. These are backpacks or some kind of packaging that contain necessary items that people can grab when they are attacked and need to flee. I'd never heard of these packets before she told me about them. She also said that some people refuse them entirely because they refuse to accept aggression as a way of life. It has also become clear that for more and more Palestinians, it is not Jewish sovereignty that they object to, but Jewish supremacy. And this leads to my last point on Palestine and Ukraine. We must make Gaza matter as Ukraine matters and as all people facing oppression must matter. There should be no double standards. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is criminal, but so too is Israel's occupation of Palestine. Our solidarity should reside with all people who suffer. Yet while Ukrainians who resist oppression are celebrated, Palestinians who do the same are condemned. In an interview on American television on March 7th, the acting US ambassador to Ukraine, Christina Kvien, stated that Russia's bombing of civilian and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine is a war crime, which it undeniably is. However, when civilians and civilian infrastructure in Gaza are bombed by Israel, few, if any, foreign diplomats, especially American, British, and Canadian ones, would dare term it a war crime. As Professor Ilan Pape put it, hitting high rises is only a war crime in Europe, end quote. Instead, the bombing of Gaza is called an act of Israeli self-defense. And what does it say when Israel's self-defense argument is used against a society that Israel itself is occupying, when Israel depicts as genocidal the very society it is brutalizing? If anything, rather than sanctioning Israel for its violations of international law, the American Congress punishes criticism of Israel. For example, Congress wants to outlaw boycotts of Israel in the United States. And on March 3rd, members of the US House of Representatives reintroduced federal legislation to fight boycotts of Israel, and 35 American states have already passed laws to punish Americans who choose to boycott Israel. In fact, writes the analyst Peter Baynart, governors who signed legislation penalizing boycotts of Israel have promoted boycotts of Russia. He continues, when Secretary of State Anthony Blinken announced last month that he would join a session of the United Nations Human Rights Council because Russia's invasion of Ukraine underscores the Council's mission to promote human rights and respond when they are violated and abused, the Palestinian-American writer Yusuf Munayyer noted that the US had left the Human Rights Council because it didn't want to see accountability for human rights abuses and violations of law committed by Israel. If it is moral and legitimate to protest Russian assault, why is it considered anti-Semitic to protest Israeli assault? If Ukrainians who resist and defend themselves are called heroes, why are Palestinians who resist and defend themselves against occupation and land seizures called terrorists? The point, as Baynard argues, is not to diminish solidarity with and empathy for Ukrainians, but it is to extend that solidarity and empathy to Palestinians, whose oppression the West subsidizes. If international law, which seems to have emerged or regained legitimacy overnight, applies to Ukraine, why not Palestine? As the Jewish activist and writer Ido Conrad recently stated, we must ask ourselves whom we are helping to fight for their freedoms and whom we are abandoning to subjugation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Roy, for this comprehensive talk, strong talk, and for the reference to what is happening in Ukraine in your last talk. It's very important for our public transnational sphere, in particular way for Mexican audience, who is in front of what is happening every day in the US mass media, which is repeating and repeat and repeat every day, just one face of the coin. Professor Roy, just let me share with you a few comments before we start with the Q&A session. I will just try to highlight some points of your talk, and I will request from our audience some feedback or questions to make a dialogue with you. I encourage to our audience to send questions to Paula, who is in Facebook, in order to have, 2 or 3 questions, and maybe we can see if we have 1, 2, or 3 rounds of questions for Professor Roy. Well, my first point, Professor Roy, after thinking again, your talk is about hope. I have a quotation of Marwan Bishara's publication in 2020 in Al Jazeera English, entitled The Third Way. Mm-hmm. This text, Bishara says, and I quote, accepting the so-called deal of the century is to surrender to Israel's hegemony. It means living in captivity in perpetuity. Refusing to give up may not be easy, continues Bishara, but it has proven effective in frustrating Israeli plans and restraining certain Arab regimes' predilection for mischief. Do not despair. Time and history are on your side. End of quote. And in these difficult times, I know it's important to recognize things in the Palestinian ground. It's true that it's not easy to motivate the depressed people. In Mexico, we can say, and in many other countries, in Africa and Latin America, the same thing happens. Also here, journalists, activists, critical thinkers die daily. But it was interesting to know how some young people insist in change. In the case of Palestine, when some young people smiled when they were arrested during last May 2021 events in Sheikh Jarrah, we realized that sometimes, as Bishara says, the best laughings are mixed with tears. And yes, there is a lot to fear, but at the same time, there is a lot to dream about. My second point is about legitimacy. In the last 2 years, many NGOs are designated Israel directly as an apartheid state. We can remember, for example, the case of B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, and the last one, the Amnesty International report. The significance of these declarations means that no matter how many dictatorships recognize Israel, many people around the world, for example, quoting Mahmoud Mamdani's book about this comparison between Israel and South Africa, many people around the world are comparing Israel today to what South Africa was in the past. This is important because many of us consider that today one apartheid state will never achieve true legitimacy and even security, not only in the Arab world, but in the whole world. And this is something that Israeli citizens must to know. In other words, apartheid will also be a slap for the Israelis themselves. Sooner or later, and when precariousness and economic, social, psychological violence of this apartheid state reach the Israelis, then they will realize what the Palestinian resistance means. Yes, of course, the BDS movement, for example, may contribute to Israel international isolation, but more needs to be done for the non-Zionist alternative to flourish in Israel itself. Is it possible for this to happen? Is this so-called Israeli democracy is so democratic to be open to anti-Zionist Israel movement inside? My third and last point, and I finish with this, it's about multiple strategies. Another interesting idea for Palestinians right now is to rethink what I call unity in fragmentation. We have multiple Palestines. Multiple Palestines can be multiple strategies. Instead of being divided in one delusion, I mean the failed strategy of negotiation like the state solution after Oslo. In other words, by unity and fragmentation, I mean a tactical decentralization of popular collective action, where each Palestinian community should be able to design and embrace strategies of struggle according to its own abilities and circumstances. I quote again Marwan Bishara. Some Palestinians in Gaza may want to retain their deterrence capabilities to defend against another Israeli military attack, when some other Palestinian people in Al-Quds, for example, may want to strain their city's Palestinian presence and character. At the same time, Palestinians in Israel may want to transform Israel's nationality from demographics to politics. Likewise, for example, the Palestinians in Jordan may want to work with Jordanians to block Israel's attempt to make their country, I mean Jordan, the alternative Palestinian state. Bishara continues and taking some reflections of Abdelbari Atwan, another Iraqi journalist, and the Palestinians in exile may want to promote the cause in foreign capitals, exactly what is happening right now with Palestinians in Chile, in Mexico, and Washington, and trying to work with non-Palestinians, with Palestinian friends, non-Palestinian friends and allies, and so on and so forth. For many people, these micro-strategies should be continuously synchronized and synergized as integral parts of one national struggle for justice and liberation as a whole, perhaps including Hamas, in order to maintain and to reactivate the popular base between many different generations of Palestinians. This moment, I mean, right now in this context in which we are, is not the first time Palestinians are divided. From 1948 and the Nakba, Palestinians have been living in division, occupation, and now, in this context, they are living in the framework of depoliticization strategy by Israel, collective violence by Israel, in Spanish language is violencia de masas. And despite all of these issues, after so many years, the number of supporters of Palestine have risen in the world, and everyone knows the Palestinian cause despite this fragmentation. I end with this quote of Professor Sara. It's difficult to end any event about Palestine in an optimistic way. Of course, we know and we feel it right now. But those who live in conditions of violence, unemployment, de-development, racism, and humiliation should know that it's necessary to be optimistic. The struggle for equal rights in Palestine is not just a Palestinian cause, but also a global one. Can be my 3 points, Professor Roy. I don't know if you have a comment of this reflection, and then we will mention the questions of our audience. We have many questions. That's why I tried to be very short. And Daniel is raising his hand, so we have many other participations, Professor Roy. Please, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Of course, those 3 points are very interesting and very compelling. One could have a lecture on each one. Let me just say this. Obviously, it is important for people to maintain a sense of hope and possibility. And of course, it does exist among Palestinians in different ways and to certain degrees. And I don't think that people have, my sense, of course, is that people haven't just completely given up. But I do believe that it is very hard for people who haven't been there. And again, although I've spent a lot of time there, I am not Palestinian, I'm a foreigner. And I could never experience the occupation the way Palestinians have. But it is difficult to understand the impact of everything that's happened and continues to happen on Palestinian life, and the way that these pressures, as I said in my talk, have forced people to focus on the particular and the narrow. I'm a parent. I have 2 children, and I would do anything to ensure that they had enough food on the table to eat. I would do anything to ensure their safety going to school. I would do anything to find a job or to eke out some kind of living so that I had enough money to provide for them. And obviously, some segments of Palestinian society don't have to deal with these kinds of pressures in the same way that others do, but the majority do. And I think we have to be aware of the degree to which the impact of deprivation and unrelenting pressure affects people's ability not only to function, but to see, beyond the present. To, as I said, for many Palestinians in Gaza, the future seems worse than the present. And so for me, the solution, or part of the solution, involves connection. It involves ending the isolation of Gaza and to a somewhat lesser extent, the West Bank. It involves bringing the world to Gaza if Gaza right now isn't allowed to enter the world. It involves bringing the world to the West Bank if the West Bank can't enter the world. I mean, there are short-term measures versus medium and long-term measures. But for me, what's most critical now is to not only provide people with assistance, and they need assistance, that's very clear. And I wasn't arguing that it shouldn't be provided by any means, but that alone is not enough. That people have to be allowed freedom of movement. They have to be allowed to leave. They have to be allowed to engage with each other and with people beyond Palestine. They need to be allowed to engage with Israelis. There are many Israelis who oppose what their government is doing, but they're barred from entering, Gaza. So at a more micro level, okay, if you want to term it that way, I think this is what I want to see happen in the short term. I think that if there was more engagement, if people felt a certain freedom, if they were allowed to leave, to move, to engage with people here, not only over the internet, which is important, but to actually have the right to leave and to go and travel as they wish, that would go a long way. Palestinians, again, Palestinians, as I've always argued, want to live an ordinary life. They basically want to live as we do. They want to have a job, they want to have children, they want to get married, they want to send their kids to school, they want to enjoy their families, they want to come and go, have freedom of movement the way we do. It's this lack of or denial of the ordinary that is so not only tragic, but is so damaging. And this is what I would want us to focus on, is how do we help restore the ordinary? Palestinians are divided, and this idea of allowing Palestinians, their own strategies depending upon where they live, has certain merit. But the problem also, or the caution I would interject into that, is that as Palestinians become more and more divided and isolated from each other, the notion of a collective, of a national collective, has grown weaker and weaker and weaker. And this, of course, has been by design on Israel's part. And, I have a colleague who has done some phenomenal research among Palestinians in East Jerusalem. And she has shown that Palestinians there, for example, want to become Israeli, in the sense that they are tired of the fighting and the violence, and they see a Palestinian leadership that has completely failed them, has betrayed them, and they want to live their lives as many young people do. They want to go to football games, they want to go to restaurants and parties and concerts, and there is a push or an emphasis among them to become Israeli, to integrate with Israeli society. okay, which is very, very different from what Palestinians in Gaza not only want, but envision for themselves, which is also different from what is happening within certain Palestinian communities in the West Bank. So, you know, one has to understand what has happened to this society that was once, you know, it always had problems and divisions, but it, you know, when I lived there during the first Intifada, it was a completely different reality. People came together as a whole, whether they were in Gaza or the West Bank or Jerusalem, and they functioned as a collective, as a national body with common goals and aspirations, and they worked together. The mobilization was extraordinary. It was an amazing time in Palestinian history. That is all gone. That has changed. It has broken down completely. So I'm not a sociologist, but I think it's much more difficult to propose micro strategies in the way that Marwan Bishara has done. And like I say, it has a certain logic that is compelling, but my concern is that it underestimates the pressures and the impact of those pressures on different parts of the Palestinian community, and how we bridge those divisions and how we bring people together who have such different needs and aspirations is a challenge, to say the least. I just think we need to be careful about that. And also, as I said earlier, and I want to reemphasize, connection is important. You know, every time I go to Gaza, or I've been there, people want me, or any foreigner really who's there, to tell the world about them. They are desperate for connection. They feel completely abandoned. And they are desperate for connection. They're desperate to leave, in the sense of, you know, moving, traveling, studying abroad, having the opportunity to engage with the world. And, you know, in the article that I mentioned that I published after my last trip, I talked with several people, friends of mine and other colleagues, who were very worried, who expressed great concern to me about Palestinians and their attitudes. People who are so imprisoned within a tiny territory and are unable to leave. When you think about it, the overwhelming majority of people in Gaza are young. They're 18 years of age and younger. They have never left Gaza. So for them, Gaza is the center of the world. And they don't know, as I said in my talk, they don't know what it's like to do certain kinds of activities that we take for granted in terms of travel and studying and moving around the world. And this affects people's attitudes. It affects the way they see the world and their role in it. And my colleagues and friends were very worried about that. And so, you know, one needs to globalize the Palestinian issue, not just politically, but in very real, practical sense. And by that, I mean putting pressure in whatever ways can be brought to bear on Israel, on America, on the Europeans, to open up the gates and allow people out, give them the freedoms that we take for granted. And the rest will come. Palestinians are very talented. They're highly educated people. They can take care of themselves in that respect if they're given the opportunity. So yes, we must always continue to have hope, and people do, and a sense of possibility. But I just want to emphasize that the impact of these pressures that are now, you know, decades old, but particularly in Gaza, particularly with the blockade, which has been so devastating. It's very easy to say, yes, we should do X, Y, or Z. It's another when you're in Gaza and you see children on the street peddling or begging, when you see entire families on the street in Gaza, entire families begging for food or money from morning till night. I mean, there are things happening there that are completely unprecedented. So as I said, I don't want to keep repeating myself, we need to bring the world into Gaza and allow Gaza to enter the world. That to me is the first crucial step.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for your feedback. It's very strong, but it's fact. And with the facts, it's important to reconceptualize what is the meaning of resistance and what is the meaning of liberal cause, the national liberation of Palestine.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Sara. Now we are making with the second stage of this panel, which is the questions from our audience. Daniel is the first. He has to comment something. And then I have 3 questions for Professor Roy. And well, we will see if we have time for another round after these 3 questions. So Daniel, please go ahead with your question and comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Moy, for the word. First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Roy, for your brilliant presentation, for your anecdotes, for your social conscience regarding the Palestine question. And I do want to rethink in some ideas that you presented, and in order to construct a solid question for you regarding my own experience dealing with the Palestinian question in my own academic career. When you said about all these ideas in Gaza Strip, where there's no more ideas about statehood. I think the ideas goes more beyond about citizenship, you know, this citizenship that nowadays we're facing this struggle of the crisis of the nation state. So I do think that we can find easily at least 2 generations, this Nakba generation, who's still in the struggle for the statehood, a real Palestinian statehood, and then we have this Oslo generation, a generation who do not think more, as you said, in these ideas of any kind of state or statehoodness. They do think in go to the school, have a job, have a water that it's clear and it can be used in its daily life. So in this condition, Dr. Roy, I will ask to you, what do you think about this idea about that we do have nowadays to face that the 2-state solution is dead? And we need to face the current situation that we already have an apartheid state, as we have been said. I mean, as Dr. Pape says as well, we have a colonial, a not finished colonial situation in Palestine. And we have this isolation of Gaza Strip as well, because we do think in Palestine and we do think and we think in the Gaza Strip, and we think about it and West Bank with the Fatah situation and with this several groups regarding Islamists, and you know well this situation. I really enjoyed your work when you criticized the Matthew Levitt book on Hamas, and I was critical concerned about all this situation, about what we know in Hamas in the West and especially in Latin America. So in your own perspective, Dr. Roy, what do you think? Do we need to bury at the end the 2-state solution in your own perspective, considering the isolation of the Gaza Strip? And in the second hand, do you think it's possible to face this idea that it's now grown up with many authors about this secular democratic state who face the Jewish idea of the state of Israel nowadays? So it's my own perspective and my own idea for you. Thank you for your time, for sharing some ideas to the National Autonomous University of Mexico.
Thank you. I totally agree with you that the 2-state solution is dead. In fact, I think it was Avi Schleim who said it was never really born, because from the beginning, Israel was never serious about 2 states. About a Palestinian state, and as I think written in as I have written in some of my articles, when I was a young graduate student and first went to the West Bank and Gaza, I spent a lot of time with Israeli government officials, asking them about their policies in the West Bank and Gaza, and some were very explicit with me that they would, even then 35 years ago, 37 years ago, they would never allow a Palestinian state to emerge. And they framed it in terms of economics. They said, we will never allow an economic infrastructure to evolve, a structurally strong economy to evolve, because that would provide the basis of a Palestinian state, and that will never be allowed to happen. And this was, 37 years ago, and they were correct. So we do have a one state situation, and for among Palestinians, and I think there's a growing sense among others that the future approach to this issue has to be rights-based. It has to be based on equal rights for Palestinians with Israelis. And when people ask me, what do you want? One state, two state, three state, four? I say, it's not up to me. All right. It's up to Palestinians and Israelis to figure out what kind of political arrangement would be acceptable, or as a dear friend of mine, Afif Safia, used to say, what kind of arrangement would be mutually unacceptable to both sides. But the point is that first, the occupation needs to end, the colonization needs to end, the settlement expansion needs to end, and then people can talk about what sort of political arrangement they want to devise for themselves. But clearly, the notion of two states died a long time ago, if it was ever really born. And whatever future arrangement emerges, it can only, in my view, be sustainable and meaningful if it is based on equal rights for both peoples. How to achieve that is tough. I don't have the answer. If I did, I'd win the Nobel Prize in Peace, I guess. But obviously, I could tell you what needs to happen, but that's in a idealized theoretical realm. But I do think it's very important that people continue to educate themselves about this issue. That's essential, both especially in the West. And there have been some very positive changes. I didn't get into others, but for example, today Palestine is one of the most important international struggles. It has one of the strongest solidarity networks, as Musa mentioned, and the whole Oslo process that is still invoked by the donor community and the language of two states has been completely discredited. Nobody believes that, it is a viable process, or that the Oslo agreements were shaped to end occupation or promote peace. I mean, all of that has been discredited. It's taken too long to reach that understanding, but it has occurred. And so, in America's role too has been exposed as being very one-sided and unfair. And there are changes occurring in the larger realm that might lead to some more meaningful change, but it's again, it's based fundamentally on ending the system of oppression, on ending Israel's matrix of control, as Jeff Halper puts it, the Israeli anthropologist, and allowing Palestinians to function as a community in this part of the world. And how we get to that point, how we get to ending the occupation, pressuring Israel to remove the strictures, remove the constraints, and the occupation, and the control, and the repression, so on and so forth. It's obviously, in large part, has to come from the outside. Not entirely, but it has to come from the West. And right now, I just don't see that happening. But again, as constituencies in the West, in these countries, grow more educated and grow more aware, which has happened. It's happened incrementally, and it's taken a long time, but it has happened. And as hopefully pressures will be created in the West to engage with Palestinians, not only in the West Bank and Gaza, but there's a whole Palestinian diaspora in the Middle East that is often ignored, but they are a very important part of this whole struggle. again, it's about education, it's about connection, and it's about, bringing political pressure to bear on governments here and in the West and elsewhere to behave more, less hypocritically than they have. And I chose to end, my talk with a comparison with Ukraine. I mean, the double standards, the hypocrisy, especially emanating from the United States, is appalling, and it's so visible, it's so apparent. But it is to those of us who study this and who have, engaged with it for so long, it's not apparent to the average American who, for example, just hears what he or she hears on American television and accepts that. That's where the education has to occur. It has to occur at the level of civil society. And, as Howard Zinn, the famous philosopher and writer, said, change comes from the bottom, not from the top. And that's happened in the United States. I mean, it's taken decades, but on this issue, there's been a lot of change at the bottom that has percolated upwards, and it has to continue. The hard part is to sustain it. It's one thing to protest, as people are protesting correctly, the horror that's occurring in Ukraine. But with time, will that protest be sustained? And in Palestine and Israel, it's been a struggle to sustain it over time. But it has continued, and it is growing stronger. But like I say, it's a question of education, and it's a question of connection too. I can't emphasize that enough. Where we insist, we in the West, those of us who have freedom of movement and some power, where we insist we want to enter Gaza, we want to enter the West Bank, we want to have a conference in Gaza City, we want to establish a relationship with a university in Gaza or Jenin or Jerusalem or wherever. Those are the kinds of measures that I think at a micro level are exceedingly important, because people there are desperate for connection with the outside world. And you build from that. And like I said, it takes time, but it can happen, and it has happened. And it's a matter of I think, pursuing these strategies going forward and strengthening them and building networks of people that are prepared to do the same. I'm not sure that answers your question, but
no, sure. Thank you very much, Doctor, for your question, for your dissertation.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Professor Roy. Please, let's invest a few minutes more in a round of questions for our audience, because we have many questions, but I will try to be very concrete in each of these questions in order to, organize the ideas we have here with the participants. I send regards to all our students who are following this streaming, and I'm very grateful for your response and for your participation in the chat. Well, the first question, Professor Roy, how do you evaluate the relationship between Hamas and civil society in Palestine in a special way for new generations? This is a question from Erica Aguilar, a very dear colleague from our university. The second question is on the role of a religion in Israel. The question is, what is the role of religion in Israel in terms of anti-Zionist politics? In the Arab and Islamic world, political Islam represented one counter-hegemony movement to the secular state represented by Nazarism and Baathism. Today, do you believe that there are religious, political, organized factions in Israel, Jewish or Christians, able to criticize colonial Israeli Zionism? And the third question, Professor, is about the role of China and Russia. How do you evaluate the role of Russia and China in the current situation? can they play an important role in the coming years, especially the Chinese? Well, 3 questions, Professor Roy. Thank you very much for another series. Thank you.
Wow. Well, the second question regarding the role of religious organizations, I can't really address that because it's not something I know a great deal about. So I would rather not address that just because I don't feel I have the expertise to do so. The first question was about the role of Hamas and civil society in Gaza going forward.
Yes, Professor.
Is that it? Well, again, today, Hamas, the answer is a more complex, a complicated one. But most Gazans, from my understanding, most Gazans today are very critical of Hamas, although they may not always express that publicly. If one looks at a lot of the social media sites that are available to Gazans, mostly to Palestinians on the outside who have more freedom to criticize than those on the inside who are carefully monitored. Dissent is not tolerated among Hamas. By Hamas, that's very true, and their role, on the one hand, their governance of Gaza is extremely problematic, has been highly condemned and criticized by people. People feel that the authority initially played a very positive role, a very strong role in not only in defending them, but in bringing order to Gaza, dealing with a lot of the security issues initially when they first came to power. And there was hope that Hamas would evolve in a way that would support Palestinians and Palestinian initiatives. That has not happened in the way that people had hoped, for sure. And Hamas's record is mixed. In some respects, they've achieved certain things. In other respects, they've behaved as a very authoritarian regime. As I said, they do not tolerate dissent. And there is a lot of surveillance, a lot of control. A lot of people feel that, monies that have come into Gaza have been siphoned off by Hamas, whether there's some evidence to support that, certainly. The overall gestalt in Gaza is that there is no authority, whether it's Hamas or Fatah, that supports them, that is acting in their interests, that is there to protect people and engage in a more productive process whereby society is strengthened and is allowed to flourish. Now, having said that, Hamas also lives under the same set of constraints and pressures that Gazans do. And at the political level, while one can criticize and condemn Hamas for many things, it is very clear that Hamas has for a very long time tried to engage Israel, tried to engage the West. They have talked about 67 borders. They've talked about 2 states. One cannot say that they have not made an attempt to engage in some kind of political process that would lead to some sort of long-term truce or ceasefire, and ultimately perhaps some sort of resolution on the basis of 67 borders. In fact, this is written into their new charter that came out in 2017. So it's a mixed picture, but in terms of civil society, I wrote a book about this. The Islamic social sector in Gaza is functioning. But again, like all civil society institutions, they are all operating now, especially under such enormous pressures and constraints, financial and otherwise. And I think in a way, it's almost an unfair question to ask because the conditions in Gaza are so abnormal. It's hard to assess how Hamas would behave, for example, if conditions improved, if suddenly Gaza opened up, if suddenly people are allowed to live their lives as we live our lives. There are many studies that argue that Islamic regimes, when they come into power, they modify. Some radicalize, some modify. I think certainly Hamas has shown that, particularly in its charter, that it is far more pragmatic and nationalistic than religious in its orientation. And I believe, based upon at least some of the officials I have known in the past, many of them, or some of them, I should say, have died or been assassinated. There were many opportunities to engage Hamas, and there were enough people who were moderate, or what we would term moderate, in the leadership who were prepared to engage with Israel and to find a resolution to the conflict in a way that would be acceptable to at least to them, and I suspect maybe to even the Israeli public if they were ever allowed to, learn about these initiatives. I think perhaps under better circumstances, Hamas. Well, first of all, Hamas is a political actor. It is a prominent political actor, and whether we like it or not, we're going to have to deal with them and engage them in going forward. And the question of whether they could function as a government, as an actor that would engage civil society and strengthen it, remains to be seen. But I think the possibility exists, and I think it's certainly worth putting them to the test and putting all Palestinians or the whole Palestinian leadership to the test if the conditions presented themselves. I think it's hard and it's unfair in a way to ask these kinds of questions in the sense that you're evaluating these movements and these actors under very extreme conditions. And how would any of us behave if we were put under extreme conditions, whether you're talking about civil society institutions or governing authorities? And this is not to in any way excuse or justify or diminish the egregious behavior of Hamas officials vis-a-vis their own people at all, or Fatah, or any actor. But it's to say that these conditions are very oppressive, they're very strenuous. They are depriving people not only of real practical means of survival, but they are psychologically damaging, and they are creating immense hardship. So how would any of us function under those conditions? And so, based on Hamas's previous behavior, based on their history with civil society in Gaza, I think that there's, again, conditions have changed a lot since I did my work and wrote the book, but, at least in the past, I'd say there was great potential for Hamas to engage in a very productive way and positive way with civil society going forward. Today, that's harder to evaluate simply because, as I said, conditions are so abnormal. I think for all Palestinians, where, in Gaza, in the West Bank, particularly, we need to focus on, we just need to focus on change and allowing them to function as we function. And then we can see how all these actors will emerge and how, what roles they can play. But I think in terms of the question, anything's possible under the right conditions. I know that's probably an unacceptable answer or an incomplete answer, but it really is the best answer I can give because it's impossible to evaluate all that under current conditions right now, I think. What was the third? I'm sorry, I've forgotten.
The question is, how do you evaluate the role of Russia and China,
Oh, yes.
the current situation, especially the Chinese, if they can play an important role in the coming years?
Well, that remains to be seen. Again, China's role in vis-a-vis the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will be shaped in part or influenced in good part by their relationship with the United States, their relationship with Europeans. I mean, it's nothing of these like this exists in a vacuum. It's all a function of one's position in the world and one's political and economic interests. Potentially, China did have a presence there. I remember years ago, they had representatives there. They had some development projects there, I believe. I didn't know much about them, actually. But, the possibility exists. Again, I can't really address that. I don't know.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. Please let me share with you one more question, because
okay.
the time is coming, and I know you have a schedule and activities, and we don't want to, abuse of your time. The last question is about recognition. In the last 10 years, some political factions of National Palestine Authority have been supported the idea of Palestine must be recognized. And as all of we know, Palestine has a seat in the United Nations as an observing member. But Mexico is not a country that today has recognized Palestine. In your opinion, Professor Roy, is the recognition, is it still a tool to help to the Palestinian cause, or in the opposite, is something that keeps things to maintain the conflict, just like we studied today? Recognition is useful in your opinion, or not?
Oh, I think, of course, it's useful. I think it's very important. Political recognition of the Palestinian people, of a state, however you define that state, is extremely important. It gives Palestinians a voice. It gives them a presence. It gives them a platform on which to, speak. So yes, of course, I don't even think it's really a question. I think it should be assumed that recognition in that sense is very important. Now, what happens as a result of that, is another question, but symbolically, it's very important. When I began, or going back, as I said in my talk, when I was a young girl growing up in the United States, you couldn't even utter the word Palestine in a classroom. Even when I was in college, it was understood. Nobody said it to you directly. You cannot use the word Palestine or Palestinian, but we understood that. And so that was, a few decades ago, but if you look at that and you look at where we are today, at least in terms of Palestine's profile in the US and in the West, it's changed dramatically. And of course, it's exceedingly important. Absolutely. And again, Palestinians, it's still tragic that we need to continue to humanize Palestinians. It is, as in my talk, I talked about the theme of dehumanization, which is very, very deep and strongly felt among Palestinians, the way in which they have been dehumanized and been considered inferior or subhuman. And this continues. And it is tragic that in 2022, there still is a need to humanize Palestinians as individuals, as human beings, as mothers, as fathers, as children, as sisters and brothers and aunts and uncles. And part of recognizing Palestine in whatever way, politically, symbolically, or otherwise, is part of this, I think, very necessary and crucial process of recognizing Palestinians as human beings, not as the other, but as people like us who desire and want to live the kinds of lives we live, or have the kinds of freedoms we take for granted. So, creating or deepening the presence, not creating, but deepening the presence of Palestinians in our consciousness, in our reality, be it in the political realm, the psychological realm, the social and economic realm, whatever, is very, very important. And again, I know I keep going back to this, but a very important part of that involves connection. And if I can leave your audience with one message or one point, it is the desperate need of Palestinians to be connected with people on the outside in a very real and practical way, not just symbolically or psychologically, but in real ways. And I think change can come, at least in the short term, if we insist upon those connections, whether as individuals, as communities, as church groups, synagogue groups, professional societies, all kinds of civil society organizations. If we can develop connections and bring people there and try to bring people here, that is a critical first step. I can't tell you how many Palestinian friends of mine and people I've just talked to and known, this is what they want. This is what they are desperate for, because there is such a sense, and entirely founded, of abandonment and isolation and being cut off. So yes, recognition is very important.
It's important not just to talk about Palestine, but with Palestinians. This is a very important difference in the language, the discourse, not just about, but with the Palestinians.
Absolutely. And as I said, Palestinian agency, the power of people there, is often overlooked. When we think of Gaza, for example, we think of this place, as I've described, a very poor, impoverished place. It's subject to a great deal of conflict and repression, but also there's another side to Gaza, which I didn't really talk about, but is as important. And that is that you have a very, in certain respects, a society that resists through cultural expression and through cultural production. There are people there who are artists, fantastic artists, musicians, poets, writers. There's theater in Gaza, playwrights. There are people who are creative and innovative and are resisting through their cultural production, through their cultural expression. There are people who are, as you said earlier, hopeful, who refuse to despair. As I said, people who refuse to accept the reality that has been imposed upon them, who refuse to accept aggression as a way of life, and who are constantly struggling against that in their own way. And so there's another side to Gaza as well. And people have agency. People have, they have power, which is overlooked, but also it can only function within, right now at least, within the confines that are Gaza, that is Gaza. So that's why we have to try to open that up and allow all that amazing agency and creativity and human power to express itself and to allow its society to grow and flourish. Imagine if people took all the creativity and energy they put into daily survival, and there are many creative ways that people have survived, which is another lecture unto itself. Imagine if they took all that power and creativity and energy and put it into productive activities where they were allowed to, build factories, build schools, create curriculum, build more universities, teach them, go on and on and on. I mean, there's so much potential among Palestinians generally. And this is where we need to focus, I think, our efforts and our energies.
Yes, so, and at the same time, every single people or every single person who has the knowledge about what's happening right now in Palestine in terms of apartheid, in terms of violence, must denounce these kind of issues.
Absolutely. And educating ourselves. People, we need to continue to educate ourselves and educate others. I'm a strong believer, obviously, in education, and I think that I'm old enough now to see, or to look back and see, that education has played an enormous role in changing the way Americans, or certain segments of American society, think about this conflict. We no longer, there is no longer only one way to understand it. There are many different ways to understand it. There are no longer only one set of questions to ask. There are many different kinds of questions to ask. I mean, people have, certain, it's been a long and hard struggle, but the discourse has opened up dramatically in the United States. And, and it varies, of course, from one part of the country to another, from one institution to another, but overall, it's a different world. And that was achieved through education, through the concerted efforts of lots of people to educate others about this conflict, and that must continue. So that's a very important process. What you're doing in your university, what other people are doing through educating students and society at large, that is also essential.
Thank you, Professor, and thanks for because we try to do this with the help of people like you, of people with Palestinian friends, Palestinian colleagues. Take advantage of this to send regards to all of them. We have many universities we have to talk with, in Najah University, in Birzeit, in Nablus, in Al-Quds, of course, in Gaza. And this is something that we have to keep doing in the future.
And I'd also like to say, when I talk about connection too, I think it's really important that we not exclude those Israelis who are, sympathetic and who support Palestinians. Like any people, not all Israelis are the same, not all Palestinians or Americans or anyone are the same. And Oslo was designed, the whole Oslo process was designed to separate people from each other, to separate Israelis from Palestinians and Palestinians from each other. And this has been, and they've been very successful. And Oslo's been very successful in that regard, but it's almost criminal. I mean, tragic goes without saying, but criminal. And so I strongly believe it's very important for all of us too, to engage with our Israeli counterparts who share similar values and beliefs, and to promote, to the extent possible, the interaction of Israelis and Palestinians. Prior to Oslo, Palestinians and Israelis, I mean, I was involved in some of these initiatives, they would get together. It was easy, much easier, certainly, but easier to get together and talk. There were all kinds of, collaborative ventures going on and dialogue groups, whether you believe in them or not, but Palestinians and Israelis could physically come together. After Oslo, the so-called peace process, it became much harder and eventually almost impossible. Because the idea was to keep people separate. And when you separate them, of course, it's harder to understand them, and it's easier to imagine, representations of the other that are not correct. So it's also important, I think, for us to engage with our Israeli counterparts, and there are many, and also to, try to bring more Israelis and Palestinians together. I think there's a great desire. I know there's a great desire among my Israeli friends on the left, on the progressive left, to meet with Palestinians. that's another area that I think needs a great deal more work.
Of
The
course.
possibilities are there. They're all there. We just have to work at making them, realizing them, basically.
Very, very interesting to know how this talk is, following a course in which civil society, Israelis, Palestinian people around the world in civil society, level is more important to think the future than in the government level.
Absolutely.
For very
it's like Howard Zinn said, change comes from the bottom up. It doesn't start at the top and go down. And it's very, very true. And like I said, I've seen that in my, old enough now to have seen that in my own professional life in the United States. Change does come from the bottom, and it can continue. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Professor Roy, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Your humanism and for your scholarship about this topic. For us, it has been very important to have the privilege to talk with you. For our audience, of course, it's going to be very useful for to know more about this phenomenon, for these peoples in dispute. And of course, let me say, in order to finish, that the open of my university, the open of my friends, my people here in Mexico City, the doors are open for you. This is something that you must know, because this is something that we have to try to do, making friends, alliances, dialogues, and with people who share this kind of experiences, because it's very useful. It's our work, but also it's our duty to keep forward. Professor Roy, thank you very much from my heart. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thanks to you. Keep in touch via email, and I say bye-bye for the next occasion. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor.
Bye.